Chronicles of Narnia, The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 7, The Hill of the Strange Trenches. There was no denying it was a beast of a day. Overhead was the sunless sky, muffled in clouds that were heavy with snow. Underfoot a black frost, blowing over it a wind that felt as if it would take your skin off. When they got down into the plain, they found that this part of the ancient road was much more ruinous than they had yet seen. They had to pick their way over the great broken stones and between boulders and across rubble, hard going for sore feet. And, however tried they got, it was far too cold for a halt. At 10 o'clock the first tiny snowflakes came loitering down and settled on Joel's arm. 10 minutes later they were falling quite thickly. In 20 minutes the ground was noticeably white, and by the end of half an hour a good steady snowstorm, which looked as if it was meant to last all day, was driving in their faces so that they could hardly see. In order to understand what followed, you must keep on remembering how little they could see. As they drew near the low hill which separated them from the place where the lighted windows had appeared, they had no general view of it at all. It was a question of seeing the next few paces ahead, and even for that you had to screw up your eyes. Needless to say, they were not talking. When they reached the foot of the hill, they caught a glimpse of what might have been rocks on each side. Squarish rocks if you looked at them carefully, but no one did. All were concentrated to the ledge right in front of them, which barred their way. It was about 4 feet high. The marsh wiggle with his long legs had no difficulty in jumping to the top of it, and he then helped the others up. It was a nasty wet business for them, though not for him, because the snow lay quite deep on the ledge. Then they had a stiff climb. Joel fell once, up very rough ground for 100 yards, and then came the second ledge. There were 4 of these ledges altogether, at quite irregular intervals. As they struggled onto the 4th ledge, there was no mistaking the fact that they were now at the top of the flat hill. Up till now the slope had given them some shelter. Here they got the full fury of the wind, for the hill, oddly enough, was quite flat on the top, as it had looked from a distance, a great level tableland which the storm tore across without resistance. In most places the snow was still hardly lying at all, for the wind kept catching it up off the ground in sheets and clouds and hurling it in their faces. And round their feet little eddies of snow ran about, as you could sometimes see them doing over ice. And indeed, in many places, the surface was almost as smooth as the ice. But to make it worse, it was crossed and crisscrossed with curious banks or dikes, which sometimes divided up into squares and oblongs. All this, of course, had to be climbed, and they varied from 2 to 5 feet in height, and they were a couple of yards thick. On the north side of each bank, the snow already lay in deep drifts, and after each climb he came down to a drift and got wet. Fighting her way forward with hood up and head down and numb hands inside her cloak, Joel had glimpses of other odd things on that horrible tableland. Things on her right that looked vaguely like factory chimneys, and on her left a huge cliff, straighter than any cliff ought to be. But she wasn't at all interested and didn't give them a thought. The only things she thought about were her cold hands, and nose, and chin, and ears, and hot baths and beds at Harfang. Suddenly she skidded, slid about 5 feet, and found herself to her horror sliding down into a dark, narrow chasm which seemed to that moment have appeared in front of her. Half a second later she reached the bottom. She appeared to be in a kind of trench or groove, only about 3 feet wide, and though she was shaken by the fall, almost the first thing she noticed was the relief of being out of the wind, for the walls of the trench rose high above her. The next thing she noticed was, naturally, the anxious faces of Scrub and Puddlegum looking down at her from the edge. "Are you hurt, Pole?" shouted Scrub. "Both legs broken, shouldn't wonder," shouted Puddlegum. Jill stood up and explained that she was all right, but they'd have to help her out. "What is it you've fallen into?" asked Scrub. "It's a kind of trench, or it might be a kind of sunken lane or something," said Jill. "It runs quite straight." "Yes, by Jove," said Scrub, "and it runs due north. I wonder is it a sort of road? If it was, we'd be out of this infernal wind down there. Is there a lot of snow at the bottom?" "Hardly any. It all blows over the top, I suppose." "What happens farther on?" "Half a second, I'll go and see," said Jill. She got up and walked along the trench, but before she had gone far, it turned sharply to the right. She shouted back to the others. "What's around the corner?" asked Scrub. Now it happened that Jill had the same feeling about twisty passages and dark places underground, or even nearly underground, that Scrub had about the edges of cliffs. She had no intention of going round that corner alone, especially when she heard Puddlegum bawling out from behind her. "Be careful, Pole. That's just the sort of place that might lead to a dragon's cave, and a giant country. There might be giant earthworms or giant beetles." I don't think it goes anywhere much, said Joel, coming harshly back. I'm jolly well going to have a look, said Scrub. What do you mean by anywhere much? Should I like to know? So he sat down on the edge of the trench. Everyone was too wet by now to bother about being a bit wetter, and then dropped in. He pushed past Joel, and, though he didn't say anything, she felt sure that she knew she had funked it. So she followed him close, but took care not to get in front of him. It proved, however, a disappointing exploration. They ran around the right-hand turn and straight on for a few paces. Here was the choice of way, straight or on again, or sharp to the right. That's no good, said Scrub, glancing down the right-hand turn. That would be taking us back, south. He went straight on, but once more in a few steps they found a second turn to the right, but this time there was no choice of ways, for the trench they had been following came to a dead end. No good, grunted Scrub. Jill lost no time in turning and leading the way back. When they returned to the place where Jill had first fallen, the marsh wiggle had his long arms had no difficulty in pulling them out. But it was dreadful to be out on the top again. Down in those narrow slits of trenches, their ears had almost begun to thaw. They had been able to see clearly and breathe easily and hear each other speak without shouting. It was absolute misery to come back into the withering coldness. And it did seem hard when Puddlegum chose that moment for saying, Are you sure of those signs, Pole? What's the one we ought to be after now? Oh, come on. Bother the signs, said Pole. Something about someone mentioning Aslan's name, I think. But I'm jolly well not going to give a recitation here. As you see, she had got the order wrong. That was because she had given up saying the signs over every night. Still, she still really knew them, if she troubled to think. But she was no longer so pat in her lesson as she used to be, of reeling them off right in the order at a moment's notice and without thinking. Puddlegum's question annoyed her because deep down inside her she was already annoyed with herself for not knowing the lion's lesson quite so well as she felt she ought to have known it. This annoyance, added to the misery of being very cold and tired, made her say, Bother the signs. She didn't perhaps quite mean it. Oh, that was next, was it? Said Puddlegum. Now I wonder, are you right? Got 'em mixed? I shouldn't wonder. It seems to me this hill, this flat place we're on, is worth stopping to have a look at. Have you noticed? Oh, law, said Scrub. Is this time for stopping to admire the view? For goodness sake, let's get on. Oh, look, 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 cried Joel and pointed. Everyone turned and everyone saw. Some way to the north, a good deal higher up than the tableland which they stood, a line of lights had appeared. This time even more obviously than when the travellers had seen them the night before. They were windows, smaller windows that made one think deliciously of bedrooms, and larger windows that made one think of great halls with fires roaring on the hearth, and hot soup with juicy sirloin smoking on the table. Ha Fang! Exclaimed Scrub. That's all very well, said Puddlegum, but what I was saying was— Oh, shut up, said Girl crossly. We haven't a moment to lose. Don't you remember that the lady said about locking up so early? We must get in there in time. We must. We'll die if we're shut out on a night like this. Well, it isn't exactly a night yet, began Puddlegum, but the two children both said, Come on, and began stumbling forward on the slippery tableland as quickly as their legs could carry them. The marsh wiggle followed them, still talking, but now they were forcing their way into the wind again, and they could not have heard him even if they had wanted to, and they didn't want. They were thinking of baths and beds and hot drinks, and the idea of coming to Halfing too late being shut out was almost unbearable. In spite of their haste, it took them a long time to cross the flat top of the hill. Even when they had crossed it, there were still several ledges to climb down on the far side, but at least they reached the bottom and could see what Half Fang was like. It stood on a high crag, and in spite of its many towers, it was more a huge house than a castle. Obviously, the gentle giants feared no attack. There were no windows in the outside wall close to the ground, a thing no one would have in a serious fortress. There were even odd little doors here and there, so that it would be quite easy to get in and out of the castle without going through the courtyard. This raised the spirits of Jill and Scrub. It made the whole place look more friendly and less forbidding. At first the height and steepness of the crag frightened them, but presently they noticed that there was an easier way up the left, that the road wound up towards it. It was a terrible climb, after the journey they already had, and Jill nearly gave up. Scrub and Puddlegum had to help her for the last 100 yards, but in the end they stood there before the castle gate. Portilicus was up and the gate was open. However tired you are, it takes some nerve to walk up to a giant's front door. In spite of all his previous warnings against Half Fang, it was Puddlegum who showed up the most courage.